afternoon. I'm Brenda Chalfin. I direct the Center for African Studies here at University of Florida. This is our weekly Baraza that we are now doing in a remote modality. It's always sad when we can't be together, but there is the silver lining of participation from far and wide. So our speaker today, Professor Paul Landau, is in Germany. We have other audience members and attendees from all corners of the world. So welcome everyone, welcome Professor Landau, and I'm going to turn the introduction over to Professor Nancy Hunt in the Department of History here at UF.
Hello, it's a big pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Paul Landau from the University of Maryland, presently in Germany. Paul and I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison together, received our PhDs in about 1992 together. And I want to tell you a little bit about his work. And I start by paraphrasing Paul. He's always been interested in other ways of understanding the world not his own. He's an historian who read anthropology, mostly about Africa, and also the philosopher Wittgenstein. He became preoccupied with the history of perception and thought among colonized people, how distorted that treatment was, and how the distortions reflected colonial power. Distrusting the whole idea of mindsets and statements about what others people believe, he instead tried to look very carefully at specific historical situations, paying attention to language. This way of approaching things has taken him far. His dissertation became the realm of the word, language, gender, and Christianity in a Southern African kingdom. The book is set among the Swana kingdom, and he very boldly, courageously took on the Comoros in their approach to the Swana in Southern Africa, including with an article of 2000, Hegemony in History in Jean and John Comoros of Revelation and Revolution. He's since published a major book called Popular Politics in the History of South Africa that goes from 1400 to 1948. Few historians work with that many centuries across time. It was published by Cambridge in 2010. He also basically began visuality studies in African history with a co-edited volume, Images and Empires, Visuality in Colonial and Post-Colonial Africa in 2002. Other small things appear that are worth noting. An article called Transformations in Consciousness, the last chapter of a 2-volume Cambridge History of South Africa, 2010, which continued kind of that Wittgensteinian approach. And an article that many people love, including Louise White, Explaining Surgical Evangelism in Colonial Southern Africa, Teeth, Pain, and Faith, the Journal of African History. It begins with dental scenes in Southern Africa. It was published in 1996. So today he's presenting new work from his new book in press right now from Ohio University Press, as well as with the Southern African Press called Mandela and the Revolutionaries, Spear. And I let him take it from here. Thanks, Paul. Welcome, Paul. Thanks for coming. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you, Nancy. I want to thank also Brenda and Todd Leedy and Candace Aho and the University of Florida. And I want to thank the Multiple Secularities Workshop Program, which is funded by the German government and directed by Monica Vollraab-Saar and Christoph Klein, where I am now. This presentation comes from the book that Nancy mentioned, Charting People's Actions at the Front Edge of Insurgent Change and Attempted Revolutionary Change in South Africa from 1960 to 64. This is a strange time to be talking to a group, and I'm sensitive to the difficulty we have in concentrating and I feel an especial ethical responsibility to proceed with care. I want to be understandable in the words I use, and I want to be audible, and if I drop out, please tell me. But secondly, perhaps more importantly for me, the responsibility of the moment is attending to what people thought they were saying and felt they were saying, and attending to the reasons that they wanted to speak. And I say that because much of the work I'm doing is based on about 200 interviews conducted by other scholars. I did about a dozen over a 40 or 50 year period from 1964 right up to recent times. And in other words, not to have an agenda, however defensible, and assemble data around it, but to recur consistently to what people were trying to do, in my judgment, and what they could know and not know at the time of their actions. Some of the people who I'm referring to, the information I get from them was given by them in witness depositions to the apartheid state, and have to be considered in that vein. They were coerced and frankly done under torture. I use these very carefully, but I need to mention to everybody that I use these witness depositions. There's about 5 volumes of them in the South African National Archives from the Rivonia trial. Without being invidious, most previous authors on this same short period, with a few exceptions, Tula Simpson, Robert Vinson, Ben Carton, some others, most authors have relied disproportionately on white Europeans' voices. And my approach has allowed me to transcend that limitation to an extent. What poses an especial challenge using this method, restricting my intelligence to what was understood in the swirl of engagement in opposing apartheid in the early 1960s, is that I'm talking about people trying to do something that didn't happen, that didn't work out. The trajectory of Mandela's and the African National Congress's campaign, and in particular Operation Maibouye that I'll talk about, was to create structures on the ground for guerrilla attacks in South Africa that would lead to some kind of mass participation and accelerate people into an insurgency that somehow involve the public and lead to the end of apartheid. The result, however, was what Moses Katani, one of the supervisors of this trajectory, called a catastrophe. The difficulty here is retrieving a real situation that ended in catastrophe because failure is an historical orphan. It's not recalled that way. Later on, many of the people involved re-narrativized the same events as part of a different story where catastrophe is avoided and there's a different ending, and in which endurance and personal effort become the measures in themselves for success. And most of all, the major historical conjuncture is the end of apartheid in 1994, the birth of a new South Africa, and that ends up reframing all prior events, including catastrophes. But the globe keeps turning, and again, we're in a different place today, and it's harder and harder to make 1994 the end of any story. South Africa today has the widest gap in the world of any country between rich and poor. I'll say that again. It has the widest gap of any country on earth between rich and poor. Anyone who's been to South Africa and spent some time there knows you have McLaren race car dealerships and private helipads, and also thousands of metal boxes with people living in them on airport roads and to the south of pleasant elevated suburbs. whatever the history of the ruling party, the African National Congress, certainly since the 2017 murder of Sindiso Makaka, it's become clear that the ANC is the domain of targeted assassinations, kickbacks, and sweetheart deals, and that the mechanisms tying the ANC as a party to communities is broken. So before I discuss Operation Maibouye in the early 60s, let me give you a teeny bit of background in the form of unevidenced assertions rather, that I ask you for a moment to accept and assume are correct. So many of you are familiar, of course, with the African National Congress, the oldest continuous nationalist movement on the African continent. And you probably know that it had a military wing, and you might know that that military wing was called Umkhonto Wesizwe, the Spear of the Nation, which is the spear in my title. It's also abbreviated MK, which is how I'll refer to it. And let me give you right away an image of Nelson Mandela to, if you can see him there as I go on here. Mandela founded MK originally as a compromise because he was not permitted to lead the entirety of the African National Congress into a confrontational mode under a central command, namely his own, devoted to sabotage. And it was understood after sabotage, eventually guerrilla warfare. Mandela joined the South African Communist Party, most likely in 1955. And all of his closest colleagues were either party members or were kept out of the party for cosmetic reasons, public performative reasons, with a real one or two exceptions, that is true. We know from the Soviet archives now, discovered by my friend Hilary Lind, as well as some other sources that I discovered, that Mandela was a member of the party. He attended Central Committee meetings, and he was informed in what was going on in them. In fact, he was asked by the president of the ANC, Moroka, when he was president, to report on what the party was doing to the leadership of the senior leadership of the ANC. Let me give you one more image here, if I can. Hang on a moment. Okay. There we go. Can you see that building? All right. That's the Makosa House. Originally, the ANC was, including in the early 1960s when it was criminalized, which I'll mention briefly, in this location, in this building, it was surveilled by the police. And this just reminds us that it was a strange situation. And as specialists will know, South Africa was not a totalitarian state. It was a kind of intermediary form of domination that had totalitarian aspects, but also components of compliance, however regretted. Mandela had, however, helped supervise the reorganization of the African National Congress and fitted it to a command structure. The so-called M plan, this is not the same M as Maibouye. It's most likely named after Mandela, but also perhaps Raymond Mhlaba, an Eastern Cape organizer. The idea was to make the African National Congress, which was a ground-up body with branches that created their own momentum, to turn that into a structure in which people could essentially take orders and which was secret, so that the membership wouldn't be vulnerable. It should also be recollected here right away that in a parallel development, the African National Congress split in 1959. in the 50s, Africanists or African nationalists inside the ANC developed their own adjunct branches, and especially during the M-Plan efforts to reorganize the overall ANC, many of those members who said and felt they distrusted the leadership split away. They tried first to take the entire ANC with them, and the issue in part was they did not want an alliance with white people, by which they meant the Communist Party. A little complex, I'll mention, because the party was not in fact a white group, but it had whites in it. But in part also the people who split off as the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, wanted immediate action. And shortly after they renamed themselves the PAC, they were involved in a passbook action, which, because of the brutality of the state, led to the infamous Sharpeville shootings and murder of 60-odd people. It's not 100% clear how many people were killed, but now, at that time in 1960, there was a state of emergency and many people were put in jail. And Mandela and his colleagues in jail elected to pursue a strategy of using force. In those discussions, however, Walter Sisulu took pains to point out that the real issue was how to stimulate mass involvement. And this goes to the sort of subtitle of my talk, which is Operation Maibouye and the Limits of the Political Imagination, because that was, he felt, the main issue. It was one thing to embrace violence or force, but it was another thing to figure out how that related to eventually mass efforts to change, and what mass participation would, in a sense, look like. Now, in 1961, Mandela's senior colleagues, some of them also party members, stopped Mandela from using the African National Congress itself to pursue this new policy. That's a significant roadblock that he hit. And like many dead ends, it's been kind of forgotten about or papered over, but it was significant. He wanted to bring the M-Plan reorganized African National Congress to bear in its entirety under his own command, essentially, or under, and he was a consensualist to an extent, but he certainly believed, and people who were close to him believed, that one needed a central command in order to organize people to have some kind of insurgent action. In any case, Moses Kotane, who was a very important person in both the Communist Party and the ANC, and the ANC president, Chief Albert Luthuli, turned Mandela aside from using the ANC and the M-Plan reordered PAC bereft ANC, and Mandela created MK. And he did so by making use of his membership in the South African Communist Party. And especially in Natal, the eastern province, where KwaZulu, Zululand is, in addition to Durban and many other cities, the emerging trade union movement among African people and other people of color was used and was drawn on to create MK. Let me give you another visual here, if I can. Oh, that's wrong. Hang on a moment. Oh, yeah. Of course, this is not fully functioning here. One moment. I was warned that this would happen. Okay. Can you see that? It's a bunch of dynamite. All right. I assume you can. So this was the mode of the modus operandi of MK. It was to use explosives. There were other techniques used, but explosives were an important part of it. In my book, I argue that it's actually the kind of éclat, the kind of noise and drama of explosion that becomes important. But when MK, which was a unique multiracial organization, initiated sabotage attacks, there was a sense of euphoria among many people participating, but it quickly became clear to Mandela and to those leaders who supported him and were allied to him, including Walter Sisulu, that there wasn't going to be any easy way to incorporate more and more people and to build a power for an insurgency using this technique. And underneath this problem lay a profound question in which really the issue was, what is the role for the public in the leadership's thinking and in the future in general that could easily be, that could readily be explained or manifested in the actions of MK in some way. Mandela left the country. I'll just see if I can click here. And largely in consequence of this sort of stalemate situation, to raise money in emerging African countries and to represent MK, which he toured with Robert Geshe and with Oliver Tambo, represent MK as the front edge of the ANC. He did this really without authority. I don't say it's a mistake or not, but that's just the way it is. And so as he did that, he represented the ANC as a liberation movement, something very different from offices in a building surveilled by the police, and also something that the ANC in a sense was not. So that this was really a conflation with MK, even though he didn't put it that way. He discovered, however, that his potential benefactors in Africa, and especially Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, insisted on the reunification with the Pan-Africanist Congress and potentially with other groups as well in Southern Africa, to create a united front, a South African united front. And so did a lot of other backers imply that this was the way forward. The Chinese who assisted the MK and many in the communist world generally, including some Soviet contacts. So as a result, Mandela and his colleagues took much more seriously the task of reestablishing unity with the PAC than has been recalled. And this meant demoting the South African Communist Party as an institution, freeing the ANC from what was seen simplistically, as I've indicated, as an alliance with white people, meaning the South African Communist Party. In fact, the South African Communist Party was already controlled at that point operationally by Mandela and his cohort. Therefore, paradoxically, in early 1962, Mandela essentially left the South African Communist Party behind and oriented himself and his colleagues toward forming a national liberation movement, not a class movement, with MK as the front edge. Let me just pause for a moment and point out that in a sense, the main thrust of the book is to reestablish Mandela's leadership. His leadership is paradoxically diminished even in some biographies of him. It's implied that he wasn't quite serious about what he was doing, or that he really was out for going to jail and becoming a martyr and so on. And those kinds of readings I found completely unconvincing. Let me show you another image here, if I can. Here we go. Okay. I have to. Can you see? I know you can see everybody there, but you're looking at Walter Sisulu in disguise after his recapture in Lily's Leaf. Sisulu was a key person in linking Mandela and his ambitions to older and more established ANC leaders. So these and like-minded African nationalists remaining in the ANC and remaining communists, by the way, there's no question that it makes sense to refer to them as communists, especially because of the ongoing organization of MK. They created a core of people in Johannesburg, the Eastern Cape, and Natal, who effectively took control of revolutionary mobilization. And beyond any other problems, Mandela's and Sisulu's later life has obscured this turn. I'm going to skip a teeny bit here because of time. A lot of people have registered that this turn happened. Nonetheless, that people were sent out of the country to receive training, and among those people trained, the best training was called Tuto, the Tuto, which is the learning in Sesotho and Setswana. Those people came back from East Germany, GDR, really where I am now, or came back from the Soviet Union, and not from Cairo or Rabat or other places. And this was seen as more than information, it was seen as the learning, which is the root of the word. It was a schooling. And these people were seen as the hope of the future. They would return and know how technically to lead and have military techniques. And their abilities were often seen as in armed struggle. And the words armed struggle, in turn, often occur only in English. So texts that are in African languages written inside the ANC will evoke the compound term armed struggle, as if the concept were at root alien. So to sum up, carrying Tuto was to carry a kind of Gnostic expertise that was obscure to others. It was a kind of mastery over something foreign, a foreign technique that could be deployed powerfully in South Africa. In early 1962, in August actually rather, 62, the US Central Intelligence Agency, or an individual in it, arranged for Mandela's capture by the apartheid state. The remaining plotters who were with Mandela continued on. The attempt to create a united front with the PAC failed, and then two major efforts ensued to alter the situation in South Africa in 1963. And this is really where I wanted to come to about 5-10 minutes ago. They're almost always treated as having nothing to do with one another, even though the people behind them were together and were colleagues and were members of the Youth League of the African National Congress before some of them became PAC and some of them remained in the ANC. And before considering them, it's important to remember or to know that South Africa was already a violent society. If you read the newspapers instead of just doing digital searches for the time in which sabotage occurred, you see that sabotage was diminished as no big deal because of the level of violence that was expected ordinarily in South African society. Great numbers of wounded and dead from fighting and crime every holiday, not to mention carnage on the roads. But this also created a kind of situation where violence potentially against the state was always present or in the air. There were also assaults on young women in the streets for not dressing correctly by rurally tied men serving some patriarchal end. And at the same time that the PAC was involved in creating a violent response, it was responding, and the ANC was responding to this kind of surfeit of violence on the ground. So Tambo actually visited Moscow on the 3rd anniversary of Sharpeville on March 21st, 1963, to ask for military aid. At the same time, the PAC was commemorating the 3rd anniversary of the Sharpeville protest, and young toughs in the PAC were assaulting passersby who did not join them. So let me give you one more image here really quickly of this man here. Who you can see is Potlako Lebalo. He, PK Lebalo, took control of the Pan-Africanist Congress after Robert Sobukwe, Mangaliso Robert Sobukwe, was sentenced to essentially an interminable jail term. Lebalo essentially moved to Maseru and managed to inspire and draw people to him, both physically crossing the border and by contacting them. And he conspired to create a plan, which he famously shared with a journalist, to, in early April, have thousands of young men kill or attack violently white people in the street. Some random attacks and also some targeted assassinations of government ministers and other things. After his press conference, which was perhaps a mistake, this was betrayed by the CIA to the British, but they revealed in cables that I've seen with the British intelligence that they had already been keeping tabs on him. So it really didn't matter particularly that he did this. And those agents descended on him, and they intercepted letters had gone out beginning this attack with coded language, language for various weapons and for various actions. And those letters were intercepted. And the result was that several thousand people in the PAC or POCO, as it was called, were arrested. And let me just change to this other screen here. And you can see these are people who were arrested in the Eastern Cape who were members of POCO, and many of them were in fact executed. The second and almost immediately following action was the action of the remnants of Mandela's core group and other Communist Party members and ANC members who planned a different attack. And they did not act through the party. In fact, they actively misled the Soviet Communist Party's Central Committee about what was going on. And if I can say, as an aside, that the question of whether the South African Communist Party controlled things at this juncture is just a badly asked question. I mean, they had been demoted as a separate ally, and in fact, Joe Slovo and others would henceforth complain bitterly about this. So to give you a couple of names, and I don't really have the capacity to show you all these images, but in the end, it was Mandela, Sisulu, Tambo, Duma Nokwe, Flagbush Yellow, Tennyson X Makiwani, Nkadi Meng, Gesha, Wilton Mkwai, Joe Matthews, a couple of others, but also Monty Naker, Mac Maharaj, and after Mandela's capture, especially Govind Mbeki, who, with Moses Kotane, really took charge of things and ran this operation that I'm briefly going to describe, with others in the party who went with them: Arthur Goldreich, Piet Bielefeld, Bartholomew Tlapane, Mike Dingake, and Ruth First, but not the institution of the South Africanist Communist Party, which was in communication with them, but which dissented. 6 men were trained in China. 4 of them were particularly important: Patrick Mtembu, Joe Gabi, Wilton Mkwai, Ray Mhlaba. Really, out of the 6 were critical. And these men were closely connected with the reordering of the ANC that Mandela had participated in and striven to accomplish, called the M Plan. Gabi and Mtembu, with Benjamin Ramotse, were founding members of the Dube, later Soweto ANC branch, and it helped organize the Southwest Townships M Plan. And Mkwai, and especially Ray Mhlaba, had pioneered the M Plan in New Brighton, which was a major township in the Eastern Cape of Port Elizabeth. So could there be a massive coordination? Could there be a massive plan to suddenly stimulate an insurgency? And these leaders met famously at Lily's Leaf Farm in Rivonia to plan this, and they created a document called AF 187. I don't know what AF stands for. There was also an AF 193, in which hundreds of men would be trained, installed in various places, and then these 4 leaders, especially, that I mentioned, who were trained in China, would be infiltrated into South Africa in a kind of coastal landing. These men who possessed tuto, this word that means learning and an elevation through learning. And with this coastal landing would come weaponry, and they would stimulate through sudden guerrilla activity, a kind of throwing fuel on what they saw as already potential violence, as I've mentioned. Arthur Goldreich was a veteran of the Israeli Palmach and played the official Lord of the Manor at Lily's Leaf, and he played an outsized role in refining AF 187 in consultation with Joe Slovo before he left the country, and Governor Mbeki. And the essential feature of things then shifted to a kind of new way of looking at things. And I'm going to just put up this share screen here, if I can. if you can see that, I love this letterhead from 1964 from Algeria. If you also see this set of grenades that was a prototype for grenades that were in fact priced out by Dennis Goldberg to be produced in quantity. The shift was to an idea of guerrilla war that was in process and involved recruiting not hundreds but thousands of men and positioning them beneath the sort of three layers of kind of externally trained guerrillas who were in place, and then thousands of people recruited locally who didn't have any advanced training, and then people coming in and stimulating things, so sort of lighting the match. This plan was entitled Operation Maibouye at this point. It was first passed around the country in various branches, parts of the ANC could comment on it, and then the Communist Party could comment on it. Maibouye means let it come back to us, referring to Africa. So this was a liberationist, Africanist nationalist plan. Oliver Tambo approved of it in London. Apparently, according to Joe Slovo, he danced around the room when he was told about it. And the executive committee of the Communist Party met 10 times in 1963, something that was technically disallowed with the formation of MK, but they did meet, usually chaired by Bram Fisher, or J.B. Marks before his departure. But the critical meetings were held in Liliesleaf or in a flat in Johannesburg with Governor Mbeki. In a sense now, Mbeki claimed Mandela's absent authority, and Arthur Goldreich and others collaborated. And the idea of Operation Maibouye was, again, to create a defined period of guerrilla warfare that would lead to change. There was dissent. Bram Fisher objected and said that this was unworkable in the prevailing conditions. And I just want to point out 2 points quickly. I know I'm running out of time here. Fisher wondered out loud why they couldn't simply use low-tech techniques like burning mealie fields of grain. Why couldn't Mkonto units set them on fire, he said. And this kind of suggestion of agrarian sabotage raised a divisive issue, the question of class, which of course was lurking in the DNA of the Communist Party. Even though this was done, and some women actually with bundles of candles targeted sugarcane fields, in other times, sugarcane field owners, Indian, South African, South Asian, South African landlords donated heavily to the African National Congress and participated in this planning. So there were real contradictions in the imagination of their incipient mass support. Nonetheless, supporters prepared not only this plan, but also a relatively unknown organization plan for the preparation of armed struggle, which outlined the second phase and had a Supreme Revolutionary Council headquartered in Johannesburg, not abroad, not in a foreign country, but in Johannesburg, and stressed the ongoing achievement of a concrete understanding of the real situation on the ground, social layer by social layer in South Africa, in order to achieve mass support. The ANC did not have more than, my guess is 60 or 70,000 members really at its height who were actually active in any meaningful way. And MK itself really had under 1,000 members. So a close reading of Mandela's own writing suggests that it's his own plan, that it's his thinking. His examples are used in his own writing that was uncovered in his own handwriting and on the arrest of these people later. And so in a sense, this was a continuation of Mandela's plan, not something new. But by the end of 1963, we know this from internal reports, there was scant MK contact via the ANC or Youth League with any ground level structures, even though Walter Sisulu specifically organized the mating of the ANC and MK at this point. He brought MK and the African National Congress together. At one point, it was not done to recruit from the ANC. Billy Nair said that he discouraged anyone in MK from recruiting from the African National Congress because they wouldn't necessarily take orders from the MK command. And there were disagreements about this, and I see my time is running out, so I'll simply say that in several meetings, and maybe in questions I can go into this a little bit more, it became clear that the issue for some people was that Operation Maibouye was necessary, not necessarily because it would work or not work, but because if a big action was not undertaken soon, control over violence would revert to the African National Congress at a provincial level. And that in particular, in Natal, there was serious opposition in the African National Congress to MK's central control. So it was as if to say, there has to be some big éclat, there has to be some big boom and some action in order for that to be avoided. And I have some specific quotes here, but it was impossible. The internal report said the M plan was not functioning in rural areas, that especially in chiefs' domains, there was no way that a big plan could be organized. Nonetheless, they went ahead. And in interviews with Peter Delius, Elias Motsoaledi, who I have a picture of, but I'm not going to take the time, said very clearly that he had got the order to recruit thousands of people. He had objected. There was objections that it was not possible to recruit thousands of people quickly, but that he was going on and trying to recruit, as he put it, to recruit the bulk. He was the major, Elias Motsoaledi was the major recruiter for MK in the Transvaal, in the Johannesburg, the Gauteng, the greater area there. So to wind up here, this is a point of intense, fast-paced action. Incredibly, the numbers of members in MK continued to go up through 1963. A surviving list of requests directed to the Soviet Union specified the need for howitzers and machine guns, and in fact, 144 metric tons of ammonium nitrate, which is really the same explosive used by the Oklahoma City bomber to destroy that building. He only used 1 ton of it. So you can imagine what 144 metric tons was capable of. Nonetheless, in spite of this, and in spite of pricing out all sorts of guns and weapons, and there were guns in MK, it's a myth that there weren't. Vuyisile Mini talked about people displaying their own guns and weapons also. A decision was taken essentially to try this out, to leave trained men among the people to see if they could win over communities in preparation for this incoming incursion. Then they were all arrested. So the arrest came in July, early July, at Lily's Leaf Farm, and I'm winding up because I know that I should. Years later, there were many internal verdicts on what was actually supposed to happen, who agreed with it, and who didn't. But clearly, things were moving forward. Sisulu acknowledged this. And it was in part a reaction to out-of-control violence, to killing people, which might answer local or even personal antipathies. People would use the idea of MK, or at least join it to local antagonism, say to police officers or informants. And the killing of informants had begun in 1963 with the approval of the surviving command. I had a recording to play that I won't play, but it's a recording of Baruch Harrison, who is not part of MK, who explains in his discussions with Stephen Sechali that, let me play it, it's worth it, I'm going to. Just give me 1 second, you'll hear it, because it's interesting. This is what he says. See if you can hear him.
We also were very wary of adventures. Stephen Sechali came to me once, it's in my biography. He said they had a plan. They were all going to come into town one day, that's Johannesburg, but they weren't going to go to work. They were going to mass in the center of Johannesburg. And I'm not sure what they were going to do after that, but what did we think of it? I went away and thought and came back and said, you can't do it. The grid system without lanes of the old cities will leave you exposed to the police. If they want to shoot at you, they're massively. And one of the few times I've been opposed to positive action.
I don't know if you could hear that. He says essentially that he advised them not to mass, and he doesn't know what they would do after they massed. And I could play more, but I'm not going to. There are some other people saying similar kinds of ambivalent things about what the masses could, in a sense, do. And sort of behind this is the idea that, of course, if everybody simply acted together in some way, certainly if they stayed home and didn't work, things would be over very clearly. But that did not happen. And just one word about whether Mandela was involved in Operation Maibouye, and then I'll be done here, and we'll think about the question of the public. He said later that he did not believe guerrilla war was a viable option at that stage, meaning when he was jailed, and certainly in 63, 64. But in fact, in his earlier memoir, and the sabotage syllabus and the organization plan reflect his thinking. And he apparently told Jesse Jackson, according to Jackson, that in 1962, Umkhonto was set to escalate had he not been arrested, quote, toward the hospitals and schools and the like. A few weeks more, Jackson said, and Mandela said we would be headed toward, quote, really bloody warfare. In his unpublished committee revised 1970 manuscript, his manuscript that wasn't published of his autobiography, he said the following: at the time we were awaiting the return of the first recruits who had been sent for military training and made suggestions as to how they should be posted. This was Ray Mhlaba and the others who were trained in China. I insisted that Raymond Mhlaba should be stationed at headquarters in Johannesburg and the remaining recruits to be in charge of their own areas in different parts of the country. So this seems to me to be very clear evidence that he was certainly aware of the gist of what was going on, if not the details of Operation Maibouye. And in my quotes that I'm not giving you, Goldberg talks about this idea of creating disorder and unpredictability so that life could not go on as usual and the state would then have to respond in some way. But I just leave you with this thought. You know, a friend of mine suggested I turn to Ernesto Laclau to think through this. And for Laclau, the concept of the public is always positioned as conceptually unstable. It's a kind of missing referent. And I found that useful to think about this notion of the political imagination being sort of conditioned in a sense by this, to use a political science word, this path dependency of action over determined institutionally and by fealty to Mandela. And perhaps the difficulty here in conceiving of how to engage the masses has unresolved contradictions in it about authority and violence and the imagination, which is not only useful in thinking about South Africa, but even potentially our own world right now. And I'll end there.
Thanks, Paul. We have about 40 people in the room, so I expect a good group of questions. If you have a question or comment for Paul, please use the Zoom raise your hand function and I will call on you. You have a question from Timothy Burke, Paul. Go ahead, Tim.
So, you know, Paul, I was going to ask you about some stuff about the international scene, but actually your closing really brought home something else to me, which is, it does seem to me we always talk about with people who are making policy to deal with emergencies, with future crises, with pandemics, that they fight the last crisis, you know, that they install precautions that deal with the thing that they last knew. And it really just seems to me, the way you presented it here, even more clearly than ever, that this is a group of people who are thinking about revolution in a context where it's unmistakably necessary and unmistakably possible, who are thinking about the last revolutions they know. And so I just thought I'd throw that out there as a thought and see what you could do with it. But I mean, it seems to me that that is the thing that's happening here, is that there are no revolutionaries, maybe in the 20th century period, who have been alive to the contingency of the revolution they're involved with until it's already happened.
Well, that's a great comment, and full disclosure, Tim knows the book already firsthand. You know, I guess that's true that they're thinking about but in a sense, Tim, the prior actions involved mass activity that had been sort of brought to a stop by killing people in the street, but also the stay at home, you know, the idea that people would simply not go to work. And I think that for Luthuli, that was the height of mass action, was the stay at home, where people just wouldn't go to work, the economy would stop. I mean, Dennis Goldberg, in the quote that I wanted to play, and might still, essentially says that could be achieved by shooting cops with snipers. But it could also be achieved by people staying home. Well, why didn't they stay home? They could not stay home because they'd lose their jobs. So the question is, you couldn't mobilize enough people for this agenda who would risk their jobs. So what I want to say about this idea of fighting the last revolution is, in a sense, what was substituted was foreign knowledge. I mean,
But that's what I mean.
Okay, so I get you. So yes, so Cuba,
Cuban,
yeah, the Cuban landing, the Moncado barracks. I mean, this was a very important idea. The idea of Algerian wilayas that would be established in the countryside was also used. So this was sort of piecemeal, taken from other conflicts that had just transpired. And that, you know, I think that's true, and it's worth pointing out. That's a good point. So instead of just blathering on, I'll just acknowledge that that's a good point there. And if you have anything more to say about it, please do.
That's good.
Okay, Paul, you have a question from Louise White. Louise,
Am I okay?
we can hear you.
Hey, Louise,
Okay,
how are
good.
you?
Hey, it's very weird only having one vision. Thanks. I want to kind of follow. I want to thank you for the talk, but let me just follow up a bit from Tim before I go into my tacky question, which is, I think you're Samuel Hines, a literary critic who wrote a really good book about war memoirs, has this concept, the war in the head. You know, what's the war you imagine you're going to? And I think it's really useful for us to have the revolution in the head. Algeria, Cuba. It's a really powerful thing. You've got Zapu guerrillas reading about Algeria and thinking, well, they didn't go around executing witches. The FLN didn't execute witches. We should stop doing that too. You know? There's a real, I mean, I think by the 60s, there's a real sense that there is a global movement of what no one is yet calling subaltern people, and they're part of it. So I think that's really, really important. The way Cuba becomes a sloppy model, and Algeria takes on this incredible importance. And it's
Louise,
also, yeah.
Before you ask your question, I want to point out that not only those countries, but also Israel played a major role in creating a model for MK, which is
I would think, yeah, not so much for Zapu, but I haven't anyway. Not so much for, but the other thing about weapons, about fobbing off all your old stick grenades on MK. But I mean, I think class, and I would also add cluelessness to the idea of burning the mealie fields. Those aren't, I'm not going to articulate this really well, but I think there's something larger going on, both with the Cold War mentors and these guerrilla armies. You get these amazing reports from the first guerrilla camps for Zimbabwean guerrillas in Tanzania, and they're taught how to make smoke bombs with chili peppers. And when these guys are being interrogated by special branch, you actually see it in a variety of reports. And this gets back to your first point. On one hand, they're going, oh, ho, ho. They're not being taught textbook things. They're being taught to use chili peppers. Aren't they silly? And then at this, within a couple months, the interrogations are, well, it's really important that they're learning in their own technology. I mean, I think the interrogators tell us there's something going on here with the donors, and I want to not dismiss kind of special branch interrogations, because there are people who've heard more of these stories than you and I have read. And they're putting them together for a different goal, but also their jobs depend on them, on putting it together more than ours do. So I'm not making a whole lot of sense here, but maybe a tiny bit.
But Louise, let me say that I'm probably unique in attempting to bring in both Zapu and the Chinese and the Soviet Union's input and the Cold War environment in trying to fathom what kinds of information people have to deal with. And we have a great discussion that we too should have, because
I should send you
the same issue about Chinese training versus the so-called Tuto training was given, where it wasn't really the full training, ironically, that they got in China compared to what they would seek out in Odessa and in Titero up north in Germany. But they were trained how to use fertilizer in bombs instead of gunpowder and so forth. So how to use local materials. And this created the same kind of issue that you're talking about. That was this silly, or was this actually the future?
Right. And then and let me just take this at one more level. The Chinese don't bring Zimbabweans to China after 1970 or 71, but they send a couple people every year in the camps. And but they are also, can I say, there's a big deal and again, this is special branch, but they're writing saying, well, it must mean something that they're learning this in Africa. If you're taught how to make a bob with chili peppers in Shanghai, it can't possibly mean as much if you're learning it in Morogoro. That's all. But I'll send you some stuff because I have a ton of things, interrogation reports.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay.
All right, anyone else have a question or comment? Okay. Sebi Akiba, go ahead, sir or madam.
Sir.
There you go. You have the floor.
Sekiba, you have to unmute. Sekiba, can you hear me? We can't hear you. Can you unmute your computer?
Yes.
There we go.
Yes, hi. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
Thank you, thank you. Thanks for a very enlightening presentation. I just have a very specific question about the envisaged role of the media in the M plan. Just wondering, what does the M plan actually reveal about the role of the media? Was the media, in other words, going to play any particular role in the plan that had been hatched to bring about the revolution? I'm raising this question in particular in relation to the establishment of Radio Freedom in 1963, of which Walter Sisulu actually gave an inaugural address, an address that lasted for about 15 minutes or so. I'm just wondering if it comes in your research around the M plan, whether it actually featured at all.
So first of all, thanks for that great question. And I just want to create the lack of a distinction. You meant the media in Operation Maibouye, not the media in the M plan, which is with earlier reorganization of the ANC, correct?
Right.
Okay. So Sekiba has just done a book with Sadat, I believe, right?
No, it's not. It's not with. Sorry, it's not with Sadat. It's through the funding from the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences, and it's being published by Roman and Littlefield.
Roman and Littlefield.
Yes.
And it's on radio, and
yeah,
and the use of radio. And I know Marissa Morman's also worked on radio. The radio I do treat to an extent, but in a sense, it was not developed as a real strategy in time to affect what Katani called this catastrophic defeat. There were attempts to use privately hoisted masts and broadcast appeals to people. It wasn't heard by that many people in time by really the close of the action of the book that I wrote in 63 or even 64. And it gets going as part almost of a different phase, if I can put it that way, in my view, and I'm happy to be corrected. And what I'm doing now is I'm looking at the sort of worldwide forum of the anti-apartheid movement as a domain of communication and organization that entails kind of local demands for change and local progressive movements, and sort of the articulation of, in particular parts of Europe and the United States and Africa and other places with anti-apartheid. I think that network really does need serious attention to radio that I must give it. And I look forward to your work and other people's work in helping me learn how to think about that. So, but I don't think for Operation Maibouye, look, I mean, people will disagree with me. Tom Lodge thinks that, you know, the sort of public performance in the media was really, really important to Mandela, even at this time. It could be, but I also think that as Kathrada told me personally, Mandela was also very concerned about his appearance and was kind of vain and you know, wanted to be, you know, photographed in the nicest suit and possible. Other people have commented about this aspect of him too. So I think there's a lot of things going on here, but radio becomes important as the story I tell is coming to a close.
Okay, great.
Okay, Paul, you have a question from Steve Davis.
Oh, great. Hey, Steve.
Hi, Paul. How are you? Thank you for a very interesting talk. So I'm just curious, what are the dangers in writing the history of MK so close to Mandela's biography?
Well, my whole task, Steve, was to break away from a biography. So maybe you could mute for a second while I answer. There was a noise there. My whole case was to focus on Mandela because Mandela was the leader here and wasn't playing. You know, I was a part of this movie Mandela's Gun. They cut me out of most of it because I didn't really say what the filmmakers wanted me to say. That their attitude was that Mandela sort of always knew that he was going to jail and so forth, and that he would be a martyr, and that really, you know, in a sense, other people were in charge. And I just don't think that that's true. But I am trying to do two things in the book. I'm trying to have him there and register his importance, but I'm also looking at the PAC and POCO and the National Liberation, the National Liberation Committee, the NCL, which turned into ARM, the liberal organization, and other groups as well, even including APDUSA. So I'm looking at the front edge of those people who understood violence as a way to organize the most people and to achieve their end. But, you know, look, you raise a question, and one doesn't want to overly look at Mandela. At one point, I have a direct comparison of Mandela's experience going abroad with an ordinary MK recruit, who I have access to from a couple of interviews, one with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and also witness deposition when he was beaten, Isaac Ronnie. And so I compare his experience of simply being a pawn and not knowing what's going on and being moved from place to place and being warehoused in a basement for 2 weeks while people came and went, with what Mandela is going through when he goes abroad and is, you know, talking to heads of state and being treated as a future head of state. And the comparison is, you know, supposed to be poignant or at least provocative to show that there's very, very different experiences going on at a local level. So I'm at least aware of the problem. Whether I pull it off, I think will be up to you and others when you know, look at the book and review the book. That's another question.
Thanks. I look forward to reading the book.
Okay, Paul, you have a question from Wendy Urban Mead.
Hey, Wendy.
Hey, Paul. Thank you so much for this talk. I've been waiting for a long time to hear all this. So I'm very keen to read. I would love it if you could tell us a little bit more about the connection to China, how it got established, and what did they learn beyond fertilizer, this group with including Rayam Shaba?
Right. Thanks for that question. In 1953, Walter Sisulu and a whole bunch of others went to China. They also passed through Israel and the Soviet Union. The best look at this is I Will Go Singing, which is the title of Walter Sisulu's interviews that he did with Hauser, and is available in a book that one can look at. So they established a connection then and there to the leadership, of the Chinese Communist Party, including Zhou Enlai. And they were discouraged at first, but they maintained that connection, and particularly Moses Kotane. And, interestingly, Kotane and Tambo went to China in 1963 after the so-called Sino-Soviet break was very clear. So even though the handwriting on the wall was you had to make a choice, and China was poorer, they were beginning the Cultural Revolution, they weren't able to be as supportive with materiel and eventually money, although that was a little slower coming from the Soviets. So there was a turn away from them. But conceptually, Mandela felt very strongly that there had to be a peasant component to an insurgency. He spent time himself in a rural area trying to figure out whether the peasants could actually glom on to an insurgent idea. And in my book, I talk about a poignant moment where he declines to really come out and talk about who he is publicly. And when he's discovered, he kind of leaves quickly. So there wasn't any real success in rural areas. And I just want to mention one other component of this. It's a complex issue, but the Mpondo Land Rebellion in Eastern Mpondo Land transpired at the same time as the stuff I'm talking about. I cover it in the book, but you can't do it in a talk. And if there was a serious idea that there was going to be a peasant-based insurgency, it's remarkable that there was so little engagement between the SACP and the ANC and the Mpondo rebels. I mean, there was much more of an engagement with the PAC. There was more of an engagement with other independent groups and not with the ANC. So although there was some legal assistance given to them. So it was very difficult for the leadership of the ANC to turn this corner and actually behave like they were a liberation movement. They had jobs. There's a thing I didn't say in my paper where at one point in Durban, George Mbele is there, and the people are very gung-ho, and they all say we should all go underground immediately. We should quit our jobs and go underground. And a vote is taken, and I think it's Mbele says, how many people volunteer to go underground? And not a single hand went up in the room. So when it came to it, people would rather go to jail. They said so, they'd rather go to jail than go underground. So this was not Mandela or the leadership. He did go underground, but this was a problem that they had in refashioning what was a kind of civil society protest movement into a liberation movement. And I think that ultimately hurt the engagement with China too. It's a complicated issue because of the Soviet Union and the intervention of Tennyson Makiwani and Poliso and others who had ongoing connections to Soviet counterparts in Cairo and elsewhere. And those connections ended up being the major ones. So that, for instance, when the Tanzanians kicked the ANC out, maybe Steve or somebody else can remember the exact date. I can't for some reason. I think it was 1972 or something. They they went to the Soviet Union. They took the entire kit and caboodle of MK out of Tanzania and airlifted them into the Soviet Union, where they, spent the next year. So the relationship with the Soviets took precedence after the split. So that's a complicated answer to a good question. Sorry.
Love it. Thank you so much. Very interesting. Looking forward to learning more.
Thanks, Wendy.
All right, next question, Paul, from Philip Jansen.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for this great talk. One of the ideas you mentioned at the beginning was this idea of retrieving a situation that had ended in catastrophe because so much of South African history had been reframed by 1994. And then that you said that catastrophes have been written over, papered over, I think was the word you used. I really like this idea of narrativizing or re-narrativizing catastrophes because I'm working on a transnational history, and I find so many narratives of transnational history are narratives of hybridity and cosmopolitanism and so on. Even though the one I'm working on is full of disconnection and failure and dislocation. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit more on your approach or your experience, I guess your approach of writing a narrative of catastrophe or of retrieving catastrophe.
Well, it was really hard because, many people give many interviews over the course of their lives and they reframe things. And you have to. I mean, you can't, you go on. I mean, people continue the fight, and no one wants to say, oh, yeah, then I wasted the second half of my life doing nothing. That would be absurd. And in a sense, what gets forgotten is this sense of catastrophic disappointment. It was retrieved because I found interviews from the 60s and 70s. A couple just stand out. One is Ben Turek, who went to Zambia after his brief imprisonment for 2 years. And he met with Moses Kotane, and Kotane refused to speak to him, turned his back on him, refused to speak to him for a full year. And Turek said, I'll never forget it. It was a shock to me. And it's because Kotane blamed you white intellectuals for the catastrophe, right? That kind of thing gets forgotten about. That Turek's, on visiting the early MK encampments, said these were horrible places. He said this in 65. He said these people should have gone back. Statements like that disappear from the record. And Steve Davis, if you're still there, you'll know what I'm talking about. I mean, the control of the narrative of what people can say and can't say becomes tremendously important in, well, continuing the idea that change is possible, or put another way, continuing the survival of the movement that persists. So the afterlife of this period is the continuing re-narrativization and the retelling of the story and the folding in of further, well, setbacks, I guess. What would you call the Hwangi incursion in 1967, where virtually all the insurgents are killed or captured? It's not a successful operation, but even today, in a recent meeting at Lily's Leaf, this was commemorated as essentially a successful operation, because by doing that, it instilled this sort of sense of, well, we're on the road to victory. Now, in the project that I'm working on now, I'm going to be face to face with I'm going to be facing the idea that people might not really have believed it was possible. They might not really have believed it was possible to overthrow the South African government. I mean, after all, they had an air force. I mean, my God. So if they didn't really believe it was possible, what exactly was going on for 30 years. I mean, and so not to end there, because I think what was going on was something grand and beautiful, as well as something impossible, because the way the anti-apartheid movement did re-narrativize and continue had really a kind of a precedent-setting effect for creating the grounds for worldwide action across the Cold War. And that's what I'm most interested in, is not saying how this is futile or whatever, or impossible. But I think the idea of narrative becomes very important. Just to take one other example of narrative, to, Philip, was your question about that. When various groups are appealing to the Communist Party of the Federal Republic of Germany, which was looking at documents just recently on this, they continually represent the entire history of the struggle as a fight that includes internal battles that produce only the leadership of, the African National Congress of African Nationalists, which is what's left after, from people who are purged in the 1970s from the ANC, or the Pan-Africanist Congress under the opposition to Potako Labalo. So the idea of a narrative which sort of produces the present is continually put forth by all sides of the struggle against apartheid as a significant part of what they're doing. I'm beginning to come to terms with that. I don't have any firm conclusions, but it's a significant element.
Thanks, Paul.
Well, it's 4:58. We could take one last question if someone has a burning one there. Nancy, you look like you have an idea.
Yeah, significance. Tell us about the significance of this book, how it will be differently significant in South Africa from North American African history classrooms.
Okay, well, I didn't go into.
We've got some novices, here who
Right.
I would appreciate having a sense of the significance in larger African history narratives. And then what kind of bombshell is this going to be locally?
Well, just the fact that there was a real liberationist effort that really met with a catastrophic defeat, destroying the entire Mandela generation of leadership in the African National Congress. I mean, there's no continuity with the external ANC. It's reconceived as a very different kind of organization. But also, and in the final chapters of the book, I deal with the effects of this turn toward the idea of being an organization that has to maintain secrecy, that has to weed out spies, that has to police itself, that has to define treason for its members, and that this is the period where the ANC is really created as the ANC. A lot of discussions about South Africa are about whether, there was a betrayal in the 1990s. There could have been really dramatic change, but in fact there wasn't. And that's why South Africa has the shape that it's in today. And I don't want to say that that's not worth thinking about, but I think you really have to go back further and see this defeat as midwiving a kind of different organization that has now taken power in South Africa and has laid claim to the ends of all of these narratives as its natural heir. And it's not. I mean, it's not. The African National Congress is not responsible for South Africa's freedom in the modern world, but it is responsible, or largely responsible, for much of the debacle of post-apartheid misrule. I don't want to end with that. I don't want to be quoted. I actually have to say I'm not only very fond of many of these people. I've met some of them and become friendly with them. I have deep respect for them, a deep respect for Mike Dingake, for Ebi Ibrahim, for Ronnie Casrels even. I mean, I know these people gave their lives for something good on this earth, and yet the heritage of that organization as a product of this time has brought us the South Africa that we in fact have now. And so that's really one of the things that the book is going to have to sort of throw before people.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming, Paul.
Thanks, Nancy, and thanks, Todd, and thank you, everybody. This was great fun.
Yeah, this was very international. We're very happy for it.
Thank you, Paul, and thank all our attendees from Europe, UK, South Africa, North America, and here at University of Florida. Thanks again, Paul.